Okay, so we're going to get started, everybody. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, both people who are joining us via Zoom and the folks in the room here today. This session is on transit funding, and we're going to focus more on the state level as opposed to the federal level, which we covered this morning. And so, of course, that will be a really big issue in 2021. So we have some great speakers who are going to talk about how transit is currently funded and what kind of funding options we'll be looking to in 2021. So first we have Sam Rockwell, who is the Executive Director of Move Minnesota. And that, some of you may remember, is an organization of transit advocates. It used to be called Transit for Livable Communities. And they have thousands of members who support transit. He used to work for the University of Minnesota Real Estate and worked in environmental and land use jobs in the past. And then we have Sherry Munyon, who works with the Minnesota Public Transit Association. She's been lobbyist for MPTA for many years, and I'm going to leave it up to them to kick this off and talk more about transit funding. And as always, please put your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to those after both of our presenters have gone through their presentations.
Thank you, Margaret. We'll start off. We're going to, as Margaret indicated, kind of walk through both the current funding landscape and the, some of the factors in thinking about what the future funding landscape could be, with the caveat that this is a pretty unprecedented year, as everybody knows. So a lot of unknowns, but we can at least identify kind of some of the moving parts. And some of those moving parts in that funding landscape are the kind of the people and the players and the systems in which we work at the state level, and on some of, we'll also be touching a little bit on some of the kind of local and regional levels as well. So we wanted to kick off just very briefly with an overview because some of us are kind of in it at the state capitol and in city halls and county government centers, and but a lot of people have the great fortune to not be. So when we think about what our broader landscape is, the folks who are decision makers and players here, we have advocacy groups and state governments and constituents, riders and so forth. And we'll touch on that a little bit more towards the end of the presentation where we talk about advocacy. The process for the actual budgeting rolls out with the state agencies, including the Metropolitan Council, MnDOT, which are most relevant here, submitting budgets, and the governor delivering a budget proposal. And then as the process works through a legislative session, we have both the House and the Senate members of or legislative bodies create their own budgets and or their own funding packages. And there's two different kinds of funding packages. And then if the process gets far enough along, they have final voted on packages from each chamber. Those chambers get together in a conference committee to discuss where, what the compromises are, because they both need to pass out the exact same document ultimately, and then that goes up to the governor. So when we think about the advocacy around the funding landscape, there are a lot of players from the agencies to all of the different members of both the House and the Senate, and who are all decision makers, and the governor. And then, of course, within the House and the Senate, there's particular committees that focus. In Minnesota, we have a biennial budget system, which means we've got capital funding years, which are bonding bills, which this last year was a bonding year. And then we have budget years. So we create 2-year budgets in the state of Minnesota rather than annual budgets. for more of the operations costs, and then those capital costs are also 2-year funding cycles. And then in every year is open for policy changes. So, you know, some of those policy changes impact how some of the funding works. As we talk about today, you know, there are a lot of funding formulas. There are different programs that have funding implications around, you know, everything from technology to requirements to public safety and so on and so forth. And so those policy issues can come up in every year. And so that's just kind of an overview of how the whole system works. And so as we're talking about everything that we'll cover in the presentation in the next few minutes, it's all within that system. Sherry, I'm going to pass it over to you to start going through our overview of kind of the systems and the geographies. And I know that we're starting with some of the greater Minnesota and suburban systems.
Thank you, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Well, it's certainly been a challenging year, and we have more challenging times ahead of us. First, for the transit systems who are working to gain back ridership, and then for the association and all of our partners who will be working to maintain our current funding, as well as seeking funding increases for service expansion. I also just want to note that we have a variety of charts and tables in our presentation today, and Margaret will be posting this on our website for you to refer back to. So I'm going to get started on the brief overview regarding Greater Minnesota, and then Sam will jump in on the metropolitan area. The first slide that I have up for you is the map of Greater Minnesota transit systems. So some of you might remember the old map, which I'm glad we don't have anymore. That was the old green and white map. And that was when there was less service and we had counties who had no service. Those were the white blotches on our green map. Today we have a very nice comprehensive colored map that will show you where the 25 county, multi-county systems, the 5 small urbans, the urbanized, and the tribal systems. So that's just there for reference because not everybody is familiar with the Greater Minnesota transit systems. This map, this new map, is also very helpful when we're talking to legislators. Just having a general map of the county saying that it has partial or complete county service isn't very attractive to legislators. They actually like to see the name of their systems and they relate to it much better. The next slide we have, I think I'll skip because it
Yeah, one
got a
moment here.
slight delay here.
All right. All right, which slide are you on?
Okay, now we have the Greater Minnesota Transit slide up. I won't repeat myself, but that's up, so now we'll be back on track. The next slide we have was a description based on the federal categories, and I'm going to skip that since it was part of the earlier discussion today. This next graph is probably one of my favorite graphs. I like the colors and the annual investment that's being made. As you take a look at that, if you look at 2006, you'll see we have gone from nearly $4 million investment in Greater Minnesota Transit, almost up to $120 million in investment in Greater Minnesota Transit. And you can see the next 3 years, it looks like things are going to hold even, and that's based on current funding. If we're successful in gaining increased funding, then that would jump. The colors also are very helpful in showing you where the sources of revenue are. So if you take a look at the bottom of the chart, you have the federal funding component, and then the general fund, the MVEST, and the leased vehicle revenue. On the next chart, we've got a list of all of the system categories. and the funding. And this chart will show you what the revenue is, the total amount of revenue. It breaks it out by federal, state, MVEST, local share, and the percentages of each of those. And one of the things to take a look at as we talk about the future and the funding challenges we have ahead, take a look at that $15 million number for state general fund. As the legislature grapples with their budget deficit ahead, we are concerned about the future of general fund appropriations. The next chart I won't go into as well because that related more to the federal funding, but it'll be a part of the PowerPoint that's posted. The next chart is, this is the Greater Minnesota Transit Programming Chart, and this actually shows you how the dollars that we have in Minnesota are being spent by category, and this includes 2020 as well as the projections through 2023 again, based on current funding. And so you'll see operations in 2020, $92 million is spent. For vehicles, $8 million. For facilities, we have $5 million. New services, $3.5 million. RTCs, $500,000. And marketing and technology, $3 million. These are all important items, and it helps to see how the money is being spent as we look ahead. And then I think at this point I'm going to turn it back to Sam Rockwell, hand it off to Sam, and just want to mention that Sam had the fortune, maybe good fortune, maybe not, of taking over as executive director, and we welcomed him openly, and I just feel a little sorry for him that he took over right before COVID struck. And he's had to grapple with that in his new role as executive director of Greater Minnesota, which is a membership-based organization with individual riders. So it made it more challenging for him. Sam?
That is a good summary. It's been an interesting first 9 months working in Move Minnesota. A lot of global scale changes afoot. And I'm getting to know everybody over Zoom, so this is, for better or for worse, familiar territory for me at Move Minnesota. So in our next slide, it's just a summary of our regional services. If we want to move to the, there we are. And these services are in the metro area where the Metropolitan Council has the primary authority versus MnDOT in Greater Minnesota. So, there's a lot of different systems, even though it's all within the metro area, and with the exception of some of the suburban services under Metro Transit's management, there are still a lot of different systems even within that, right? We have our regular route buses, including the high-frequency transit network buses, or which actually includes buses and trains, kind of the backbone of the network. We have the commuter buses within that, and then we have our trains and bus rapid transits, and some commuter rail, and then other services as well, which have started to separate out in funding categories like Metro Mobility and then our suburban transit systems. So, when you start to back up and you look at how these different systems look, our next slide here is intended to look as chaotic as it does. Our bus line, when you kind of put it all together, we have our bus map on the left, which is inscrutable because it's such an extensive system. And then when you kind of pull out those, what we call the metro system, Metro Transit calls the metro system, those are those bus rapid transit lines and the rail lines, which of course have a planned build out. If we go to the next slide, which will be touched on in some of our further discussion, planned build out, including several lines on here that actually are appear to be back on the table as our bonding bill is up for discussion in October again. So, this is largely bus rapid transit, although of course you see Blue Line connection and the Green Line Southwest LRT extension on there as well, which our thought now is a little bit out of date there since that's sort of up in the air. So what does all this look like from a current funding standpoint? If we go to the next slide, we see that we have, again, a number of different sources coming in, significantly less federal coming into this. The biggest curveball from a funding standpoint in the next year is how these numbers look, right? You see fare collection within the total revenue is pretty high, surprisingly high for the metro area, so close to 25%. And of course, ridership is down 65, 70% on the metropolitan area system. So that is a huge divot out of the regularly expected revenue. This is 2019 number. These are 2019 numbers here. And then of course the motor vehicle sales tax has been kind of a wild card and a little bit of a bittersweet pill as we look at what some of those numbers potentially are. There have been some strong car sales as some people are looking at those modes as alternatives to transit. There's also, obviously, we're in an economic recession. We'll need to see where that goes. So this is informative to see where we've been. I think I know from recent conversations with Metro Transit and some of the folks at the state, there's a lot that's going to have to be sorted out as we move through the next funding year as we look at that long-term funding. And then our next slide, Sherry, do you want to talk?
Yes, thanks, Sam.
Yep.
The next slide we have for you references our suburban transit systems. Over recent years, there's been a consolidation of suburban transit systems, and we have a map to share with you that shows their service area today. And also some of the map includes their commuter routes as they provide service to their constituents. Before COVID, suburban transit systems were also growing, and it's interesting to note that Southwest Transit is the second largest transit provider in the state of Minnesota today. And then our next slide, we're going to talk about investments. And as all of you have been rising to the challenges your systems has faced, we're hoping that we can convince legislators to rise to the challenge when it comes to transit funding. The next chart deals with transit funding needs. I'm going to let Sam talk a little bit about those metro area projects, and I'll just point you to the suburban transit and greater Minnesota service expansion needs that are down at the bottom of the page. We'll talk more about the dollar amount there, but in total we're looking at about $300 to $350 million a year over the next 20 years for metropolitan area service needs, and another $246 million for the greater Minnesota transit service needs, bringing us up to $246 million by 2030, I believe it is, as we expand service there. I put volunteer drivers on the list. I don't put them down there because we're asking for a specific appropriation for volunteer drivers, but it's a reminder to everybody about the importance of volunteer drivers and the cost savings to the state of Minnesota. We do have a small funding request to the legislature going through the tax committee for an income tax subtraction to help prevent our volunteer drivers from being required to pay taxes on their mileage reimbursement, which is an unjust error in the law. With that, Sam, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, I'll walk through some of these just so we're all sort of up to speed on some of the capital and system improvements we've been talking about. So as I mentioned in the last, or a couple slides back, as we look at the 10-year outlook of the metro area system, bus rapid transit is really playing a leading role in how Metro Transit is looking to expand that network. So the B and the D lines, as we see up here, those are ready to roll. Engineering's done, they're shovel-ready projects, and we'll see those reflected in some of the upcoming slides and some of the bonding numbers. The E line has had some preliminary engineering, needs a bit more. The B and the D line run on Chicago Avenue and then up through North Minneapolis, and the D line connects uptown Minneapolis to downtown St. Paul. So both core lines there. The E line is another arterial bus rapid transit line, and then the gold line is in the East Metro, and it is a highway bus rapid transit. So there's two different kinds of bus rapid transits, which I know folks know, but they are kind of different scales. Their Network Next is Metro Transit's broader system kind of visioning process for how we expand the services of the system through bus rapid transit rollout largely. They have an open survey, open through some hour of the day tomorrow. So get in there and if you haven't already, and express your opinion on what their priorities should be. And then of course, Blue Line extension, as we talked about, and there's the TAP and so forth. That is a transportation action plan within the city of Minneapolis. They have set a variety of local goals, which are becoming increasingly relevant for transit. We'll talk a bit later about sort of some of the multi-jurisdictional complexities of transit. I guess I can pause right now and reflect on that. So, you know, we know, obviously, as we've touched on, we've got MnDOT and we have the Metropolitan Council as the lead agencies on transit. But in particular in the metro area, where versus the greater Minnesota, where in greater Minnesota you have MnDOT often, not always, but often controlling the right-of-way on which buses travel and the systems. The metro area, we have a much more complex system where a bus might be running on a county road, stopping at city-controlled stoplights, run by the Metropolitan Council, funded by the state. So you have a layering of jurisdictions, and that means that everybody kind of gets to weigh in. And so you have entities like cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul weighing in on transit and stating their intent to paint bus lanes, which is great. That they are pushing on that, and they're starting to look for funding in their own systems, their own budgets, but it does add a level of complexity there. So we're not just looking at that state level funding. And then there's been a variety of discussion of bus rapid transit or transit lanes on I-94, a couple different stretches of I-94 at kind of varying levels, early stage conception. And then Move Minnesota, our advocacy campaign noted here, which we're just kind of getting off the ground, is working to kind of augment and speed up a program within Metro Transit, which is a speed and reliability program. So the speed and reliability program is something shy of Network Next, which is kind of rolling out full lines, but looking at the individual kind of components of BRT. I think of it as the individual components of BRT, and being able to roll those components out in a more piecemeal but short-term way. So, for example, giving a particular line of the whole system signal priority, or adjusting the stop spacing. Small changes that are affordable, that just take some political will and some engineering to change, but can speed the whole system up there. And so there's a lot that we can do even in these times with uncertain budgets to improve how transit is functioning for the riders, and thus also increase that dedication to transit and and attractiveness of transit. And, something that Sherry and I didn't touch too much on in this presentation is COVID. And one of the things that I think is important to note is that the system improvements, what makes for better transit, is almost always aligned with what makes for healthier transit, right? So if you've got more circuits that a vehicle can make in an hour because it's traveling faster, you've got service improvements and you've got greater social distancing between riders. If the vehicle is moving faster, you have shorter time on buses and the ability to limit that exposure and so forth. So I think that's an important piece just to think about and also to use as an advocacy tool. So Sherry, I'll turn it back to you.
The next chart you're going to see is a bonding recommendation chart. This just gives you an idea of what's been happening at the Capitol, and it's a kind of stark difference between what the governor was trying to accomplish, what the House was trying to accomplish, and where the Senate came down on these capital investment projects. But quickly you'll see that there was about $116 million in investment recommended by the governor, and then another $126 million had been recommended by the House, and the Senate had recommended a mere $2 million. So they had quite a bit of difference between them. On the next chart, you'll see continued negotiations, and it gives you a little bit of an idea of how things change based on where they started out. There was a special session bill that we had hoped would pass with capital investments, and you'll see that the safe routes to school was decreased, as well as the passenger rail program. Greater Minnesota Transit, for instance, went from 10 million down to 2 million. The Northfield Regional Hub was included. Bus Rapid Transit stayed at 55 million. The Senate had made it all the way up to 12. And the Apple Valley system, which you saw on the previous chart, had been left off. And good news today, this is kind of breaking news, is that our leadership working on the capital investment bill is actually meeting while we're talking, and it sounds like they're making some progress. So today I'm even more hopeful than yesterday. Not having discussions obviously means we can't get to a compromise, but when they're sitting down for a few hours and talking back and forth about proposals, that means we might actually have a shot at seeing a bonding bill pass later this month. The next chart, this is on CARES Act, so it's federal funding, but just a quick reminder that Minnesota did receive $2 million, which was absolutely critical here to help our systems meet their challenges with COVID. And as you heard Sam mention, just all the investment and time that was needed to make sure that buses were sanitized, drivers were protected, passengers were protected. It was an enormous cost. And the metropolitan area received $226 million. There was $54 million to rural transit and another $27 million to small urban. When you start taking a look at costs and you think about the fact that social distancing means you can't fill your buses up anymore, you need more buses to move less people, it really affects the bottom line. The next page is just a further breakdown of the CARES Act. It's actually funded, broken down by the systems, and so that will be on the web page as well. And now we're going to move and talk a little bit about our challenges and opportunity and advocacy. I already mentioned that the Metro funding gap is $300 to $350 million a year, and that comes right out of the transportation policy platform. And the Greater Minnesota Transit gap is $20 to $40 million a year. Some of that difference is because we don't really believe we should be considering only meeting 90% of the goal in Greater Minnesota, but 100%. But there are different plans for either meeting 90% of the need or 100% of the need over the next 20 years. So we will continue working on that and making the case globally on the need for funding. And then we've put together a list of a variety of funding mechanisms. Sam, I don't know if you want to start, and we were going to do a little history on CTIB and county sales tax options.
Sure. Yeah, we can kind of bounce back and forth on this one. CTIB, for those who don't know, is kind of the historic Counties Transit Improvement Board, historic local sales tax mechanism, which allowed for counties in a coalition to impose sales tax to fund transit. That was rolled back 3 years ago, I think. I'm blanking on exactly when. 3 plus or minus a year, I think, is a safe bet. And state law changed to state law has to authorize a county level sales tax. State law changed to allow for up to a half-cent sales tax to fund transit. So both Ramsey County and Hennepin County have half-cent sales taxes, which are going into pools, which are, the intent is that pool is there for transit funding. They have enumerated within their own county resolutions the projects. They have to specifically list the projects for which they're going to spend money on, and so the project that has been kind of driving the savings and banking of cash at Hennepin County has been the Botno project, which, as everyone knows, is now kind of up in the air because of BNSF negotiation breakdowns in terms of 8 miles of the route and use of that right-of-way. And then in Ramsey County, most of the money, if not all of the money, is earmarked for the Riverview corridor. So, it doesn't need to be held for those purposes, and I think there have been questions at the county level on whether some of that money should be used for purposes other than the Blue Line, and it could be for other transit purposes, and it could be for non-transit purposes as well, which as a transit advocate, I hope is not the case. And spent a little bit talking about this right now, largely because it's a lot of money. Hennepin County is sitting on about $100 million of cash right now, and their projected revenues, which again, who knows what the projected revenues are in today's world, but the projected revenues pre-COVID were about $125 million into that pot a year. So it's a lot of money, particularly when we're looking at some of the gaps we've got here. So that is CTIB. Sherry, do you want to touch on a couple of these as well?
I'll walk through some of the funding mechanisms, and you can jump in wherever you want, Sam. Some of the other
Perfect.
things that we have been working on are in collaboration with others. I represent MPTA at the Transportation Alliance Legislative Committee table, where other organizations and local government representatives sit as well. And so a lot of these funding recommendations have come through that group and have been adopted jointly, which is very helpful as we work on a package. One of the things we try to do is put together a complete package, roads, bridges, transit, that has a little bit of something for everyone, and to try to keep legislators from splintering off. That doesn't work as well as we would like, but it does help to have a comprehensive package and to have options. So if a particular group of legislators does not like one funding mechanism that's been recommended. There are other ideas. So not having an increase in funding for our transportation systems statewide for all modes is not because there aren't enough ideas. It's because there's a lack of will to adopt any of the ideas. I'll start walking down the list kind of quickly. One of the things that's been recommended for the region, metropolitan region, is allowing an increase in the authorization for regional transit bonds. The regional transit bonds, this is a property tax issue in the Metro Transit District under the Met Council, and these funds are raised and used to buy buses. But that's not growing, the revenue is not growing enough to keep up with the demand for replacement buses. So the recommendation is to increase the authorization on bonds. Also a recommendation that local sales tax be an option for cities, not limited to counties. That's a funding mechanism that a lot of cities might not be interested in using, but others would use it if they had the ability to do so. And then a statewide sales tax. Frankly, there isn't much support for a statewide sales tax, one funding mechanism for the entire state and cutting up the pie, but it is another option that we could take a look at for additional revenue. One that wouldn't raise a lot of money, but we're looking at everything available, is a fee on transportation network companies. This is a small fee. If I remember, it's about 4% on the fares. That would help our transit systems as well. And then increasing the general fund base, both for Greater Minnesota and the metropolitan area, which would include additional general fund for our suburban transit systems. The motor vehicle sales tax is another area. We'd like to see an increase in general in the motor vehicle sales tax, and then that would lead to a higher share for roads, but also for transit, and that would be more money for Greater Minnesota Transit and the metropolitan area. Our suburban transit systems receive funding from the MVEST as well, and that has not kept up from where it was originally imposed, and so we've recommended increasing the split of, or the percentage that would go to our suburban transit providers from 4.3% to 5%, and that's an additional $1.5 million for them. Also have recommended an increase of lease vehicle revenue for Greater Minnesota Transit, taking it from 28% to, I think that was supposed to be 30%, and that would raise an additional $10 million a year. As we look at these different funding mechanisms, the sales tax, the fuel tax, the license tab, I want to point out that fuel tax and license tabs are on here because all of these other transit funding mechanisms that we've put on the list aren't going to go forward if we don't take care of our road system as well. And when we're talking about shifting revenues and MVEST and lease vehicle revenues, then we have to have additional money in the big pot for our highways and bridges. And I mentioned earlier, volunteer drivers is something that we have begun watching closely and making sure that we can help them out. I think I might have got a little off track with my slides. No, we're good. Additional funding mechanisms, advertising on buses, bonding, which we had mentioned before. There's a local share of funding in Greater Minnesota, and frankly, this is getting to be a bigger dilemma for our local systems, particularly under COVID. Some of this local share might be from local tax levies, it might be from fares, but there's also a large number of systems who rely on contract services with day activity centers or contract services with colleges, and those contracts aren't doing so well right now, and it'll make it very difficult to continue to meet the statutory obligation on the local share. So we'll be taking a look at that for the legislative session and potential changes. Sam, if you want to jump in on any of that. If not, maybe we'll move to the next slide. Are you still with us?
Sorry,
Sam?
I was on.
Oh, okay.
I was on mute. I said, I think the next slide, or in a couple of slides, kind of sums this up well, which is, I think our first bullet on a subsequent slide is transit funding is complicated. So there's a lot of moving parts. There are other potential concepts on the table as well. Talking with folks in the governor's office and legislature. It's going to depend. People's appetites for different tools is going to be different depending on the politics and who's in office. And that's neither here nor there. But some of the, for example, sort of environmental fuel taxes and so on are going to have a greater appetite under Democratic control, where some of these will be more attractive under split legislature, Republican control. So I think it's important to kind of have a toolbox here, and Sherry did a really nice job of walking through this, and part of this is just going to be analyzing what's feasible under the politics at the moment.
Okay, move to the next slide, please. All right.
Here it is.
Yep. Do you want to start, or?
Sure, we can walk through a little bit. I'll bounce around a little bit. As I just said, transit funding is complicated. I think that's one of the larger takeaways here. It is in particular important, and we'll talk about this in a bit, I think, to get around that impediment by kind of creating that picture of a vision of what we're trying to accomplish. When we look at the breakdown of where funding and revenue has been coming, and we think about the tools we've got, it's a real patchwork, and so it's really got to be driven by that vision, which then also helps with the complications of governance, which we have listed here, both the partisan complications and complications just between varying priorities. Transit and transportation is not the only thing on the list, as we all know, and ideas of how to get there, and priorities within transportation, both between Republicans and Democrats, between urban, suburban, greater Minnesota, between different committees and so forth. Constitutional dedication is, I think, is an important thing to think about with our transit funding. This is one which is impacted a bit by some policy. So within the Minnesota State Constitution, there's a breakdown funding formula for funding of the trunk highway system and a variety of other systems. And one of the questions is, how much of that can be used to support transit investments? There's a law on the books right now which says it cannot be. If you have money for going into a trunk highway fund, that does not mean highway does not include transit, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. That's a policy question within the interpretation of that constitutional provision. So it adds a layer of, and that's called the Molyneux rule. It adds a layer of complication. And then I think we've touched on a fair number of these other. Sure, if you want to talk a little bit about the sort of equity issues and local share for Greater Minnesota Transit.
I'd like to address the governance issue, and one of the reasons that's on the list is it's really more about the metropolitan area than it is in Greater Minnesota. And just having complicated funding, complicated governance in and of itself, complications we deal with at the Capitol all the time. It's when it becomes an impediment, and governance in the metropolitan area is becoming a bigger impediment, and some of that has to do with the structure that has been established by the legislature and how the Metropolitan Council and the suburban transit systems deal with each other. And unfortunately, it's become divisive and not collaborative, and having a lack of collaboration and having divisiveness splits legislators. So anytime we have legislators who can pick one side or the other, it's a lose-lose for everybody as we seek transportation funding. So hopeful, another issue that we need to keep working on is this collaboration, and by the very nature of the Metropolitan Council being a policy setting body that oversees a transit system that they have fiscal responsibility for, there's probably gives you reason to understand why there's a difference between the way they look at their suburban transit systems and the way they look at metro transit. So we'd like to get rid of that and find a way that those systems would all be able to work more collaborative as we go forward in the future. If we have a more collaborative approach, it's a more unified approach, and again, it gets back to seeking legislative support. Having many funding mechanisms, even though complicated, sometimes that's the easiest way to move forward, having multiple sources where you can raise each source just a tiny amount without any big increase makes some legislators feel more comfortable. There are equity issues. There's equity issues in service. There's equity issues in funding. One of the issues when you take a look at local share for Greater Minnesota transit systems, or if you take a look at counties imposing taxes on themselves for roads and transit, is that counties who have more higher population and more of a tax base have the ability to raise more funds to expand and meet some of their needs. Obviously, those local taxes don't meet all their needs, it only helps, but other counties don't have the ability to raise local revenue. And so those counties are kind of stunted in their transit and transportation packages. COVID ridership levels. This is an issue that's probably going to haunt us for a couple of years as we look at funding. For legislators who aren't big advocates of transit in particular, public transit at least, this issue is a big one. And they are looking at ridership levels and they're seeing the major decrease, and then they're watching to see where service is increasing. And so one of the things that we've done is a lot of work to help reduce congestion and to market to individuals to leave their cars at home or not buy a car and rely on public transit. And those are the riders of choice. And the riders of choice are likely to be the last ones to get back on public transit for two reasons. A large number of them aren't going to their offices downtown, and they're all working remotely, like our conference is today. And secondly, they're afraid to get back on the bus under the COVID and not knowing who's on the bus, and we don't have temperature readers like we did at the Civic Center today and yesterday to take temperature to make sure everybody is safe when they get on the bus. So ridership levels, that's going to be something we'll see debated this year, hoping it won't be an issue that's used between Metro Transit and suburban transit, because we all need to work together to increase ridership and to continue to work for funding. The worst thing in the next legislative session as they prepare the biennium is a reduction in funding for transit due to low ridership levels, because this will be something that we have a very hard time to recover from. Once things get back to normal, we don't know when that'll be. Will it be in the summer of 2021? We don't know. But when it does come back, we have to be prepared. We have to be able to have the funding for our buses and for the operations necessary. We can't be sitting there with passengers who want to ride and not be able to move forward. The other impediment on our list for funding this year is the budget deficit. While legislators are grappling with a $2.4 billion deficit and transit advocates and road advocates are asking for an increase in funding. That obviously is going to butt heads with legislators who are looking at how to decrease spending while we're asking for increased spending. And governance is on there twice, so I'll skip that.
Sherry, before we move on, I just want to touch on the COVID ridership levels. I think you put strong emphasis on that, and it is really important that both, those of us who are having communications at the Capitol and also those who are, who are operating our systems kind of have the tools to rebut that. I mean, there are low ridership levels. There are still tens of thousands of people riding transit every day. And so it is critical that we maintain service. I mean, it's something like 70,000 people, 70 to 80 around the state. And it's critical that we retain service so that those people can get not only to their jobs, but to all the other needs that they have in their lives. And to block them from being able to get to their daily needs and their jobs would have enormous social and economic impacts. And in preparing for this, Sherry and I were talking about the fact that yes, ridership is down. Also, drive commuting is down. The downtown Minneapolis parking ramps are at 12% capacity right now. And so ridership is down also because we're asking people to stay home and to try to work from home. And so to take sort of punitive measures because folks are responding to what the government has been asking them to do would be wrongheaded and really set us back, as Sherry noted, for a number of years. So I just wanted to sort of underscore the importance of us thinking about how we move through this pretty complicated couple of years here.
On the next slide, I think there's two issues that we haven't addressed yet that you wanted to mention, Sam, on right-of-way and park and ride lots, bike lanes.
Yeah, we touched on kind of the main themes in here. This falls also under the sort of transit is complicated and multi-jurisdictional. It's important to remember as we think about transit and as we think about the needs of transit riders that we think about how they get to and from transit, right? Whether that's in park and ride, via park and ride and on local streets. And so making sure that those park and rides are in accessible locations, or whether it's by walking or biking. And so thinking of transit not just as the stop to stop or station to station trip, but as the actual door to door trip, I think is important for us to remember as we think about what the funding needs are and to be what the funding needs are in order to make a system that really functions well for the riders there. I think that we covered pretty much everything else on there.
Yep. So then we'll move on to 2021 and what do our prospects look like? We know that October brings us back to a special session. Legislators will be called in by the governor in the middle of the month. He hasn't picked a date yet, and as mentioned earlier, there are still negotiations going on. We've had negotiations going on and opposition to passing bills while the governor maintains his COVID emergency powers. There's a group of legislators who isn't interested in voting for anything. And now as the budget deficit is becoming fast a reality for legislators to deal with in January, there's a group of legislators who aren't interested in passing legislation that either spends money, cash out of the general fund today, or that is bonding because it's a future obligation. But having said that, I mentioned earlier, I am optimistic with a meeting that's taking place today. This is 3 weeks in a row, I think, that leadership has had some discussions on a bonding bill. So the possibility of a bonding bill is becoming more real. With the passage of a bonding bill, you might remember that during special session, the omnibus tax bill, small one, was attached to the bonding bill. And the omnibus tax bill does have the provision of a tax subtraction for our volunteer drivers. So that bill isn't being debated as much as the bonding bill. And our piece, the volunteer driver tax subtraction, is very minimal money. It's been agreed to. I think if there's a global agreement, we don't have to worry about losing that little bit of money. Not only do we have an author, the vice chair of the tax committee, who's committed to this, the tax committee chair in the House himself is very committed to getting this passed. Increase in CARES Act, this is also becoming a little bit more of a reality. Now the optimist in me is showing, but we even heard the president this week talking about wanting to get some money moving for citizens. And this morning, Representative Pelosi and then Mr. Mnuchin from the president's office were supposed to be having discussions on the possibility of an agreement on the CARES Act. That's a lot further away in my mind than the possibility of a bonding bill. But again, people are talking, and I get excited whenever people start talking to each other. The budget deficit, well, as you can see, we put down that dampens our hope of a large omnibus transportation funding bill. But that doesn't mean that we and all the other transportation and transit funding advocates will work any less hard than we've worked any other year. In fact, we'll have to work harder, because while we continue to tell legislator what the future needs are to grow our system and to maintain safety and to keep people being able to move around, live in their homes, we'll also be fighting the urge by legislators to reduce funding while they seek to balance the budget. That $2.4 billion is looming ever closely. It's unbelievable how things can change on a dime. We entered the legislative session with a $1.4 billion plus, and now we're at a $2.4 billion minus that we're looking at. I think it was mentioned earlier that the MVEST receipts are up. It's kind of interesting, but with businesses down, one of the things that happened was car dealers started selling their cars with extremely low to no interest, and people were buying new cars. So that money is on the rise, but that won't balance the budget by itself. And there were also some changes when the state sold bonds this summer, and that saved the state some general fund money as well, but not enough to erase the deficit. One of the important things that Sam and I want to leave with you is what we're already hearing from legislators, whether it's the bonding committee chair or an appropriations chair. You're going to start hearing more of this message. The message is, well, transportation is important. However, with this budget deficit, we're going to have to work really hard to protect education and healthcare. And we're counting on you to make sure you tell your legislators that education and healthcare don't exist in the vacuum. And as transit providers, you're out there moving people to school and you're out there moving people to their medical appointments. So we need your help getting that message. It's not an either and. Yes, they need to protect funding for education. Yes, they need to protect funding for healthcare. But by golly, they need to protect funding for transit so passengers can get to those appointments.
And I think, this is, it's something to reflect on as we're having conversations, and, all of us make a difference in having these conversations every day, particularly as people who are kind of in the, in the weeds on running these systems and operating these systems. It's critical to think about and to communicate to folks the value of transit. The chair is talking about the value of transit as a connector. There's value of transit as a healthier way of traveling around as we think about health, and not just access to health care, but reduction of particulate emissions. As we think about, the governor has 5 stated priorities. It's climate change, children and families, racial justice, there's a criminal justice, and there's one more which I'm blanking on. But transit really ties into all of those priorities, right? And I think that articulating how investing in transit is a climate investment, how investing in transit is a way of connecting children to their after-school activities and to schools. The Governor's Children's Cabinet has highlighted transportation as one of the greatest factors in whether or not children participate in after-school activities. And so thinking of the intersections of what all of us do every day and all of you do every day, and these bigger issues that get talked about in the halls of the Capitol, in city halls and counties and at the federal level is really important. And I think we'll be able to keep this, the importance of these investments in everyone's sights.
Do you want to start on the next slides? The next 2 slides kind of overlap each other, so go ahead.
Yeah, and to that messaging point or factual point, we wanted to talk a little bit about how who, in addition to the operators and transit system employees, are bringing forward these messages about the importance of transit. So, it ranges from local government officials who need their citizens to be able to access jobs and school and healthcare, senior organizations, with large percentages of folks, outsized percentages of folks who are not able to or choose not to drive anymore, who have become particularly invested in good transit. And I think this also highlights the importance of transit, not just for the commute, but for all of those everyday activities. And we know that commuting is actually only about 5%, 1/5 of all of the total trips taken, transportation trips taken. Environmental groups have touched on climate briefly. We know that transportation is the greatest source of climate emissions in the state of Minnesota, as it is in the United States as a country. And so there's a major investment from environmental groups in advocating for strong transit and successful transit. Chambers, Rotaries, VFW, again, as an understanding of the importance of connecting folks to opportunities. I know that there is a looming gap in employment need versus the job pool in the metro area, and having high quality transit and transportation is critical. We see how many jobs folks are able to reach via car in half an hour versus how many jobs folks are able to reach in transit in half an hour. The disparities are incredible, and so there's a strong push from our business and civic organizations to change that. We've talked a little bit about the importance in education and human service, and then local media. There is always a good tool both to reach out to local media and the opinion pages of local media as an avenue for advocacy, both on the editorial pages, and we had a nice just demonstrating that intersectionality of the importance of transit, a good advocacy for BRT bonding and transit bonding from a group of county commissioners, city council members, and state legislators around the issue of racial justice this past summer. again, highlighting that importance. And then, of course, the folks most impacted, which are all of you and the folks who ride. From a coalition standpoint, our next slide here, we've got us and Sherry and Margaret as some of the larger coalitions. Move Minnesota and our Transportation Forward Coalition is focused here on transit needs statewide and also on pedestrian and bicycling infrastructure. We also do a little bit of advocacy on our platform around electric vehicle infrastructure as well. Again, building off of the interest and investment of environmental groups in seeing a better transit system. Minnesota Transportation Alliance, Sherry, I'll let you, and I know Margaret's on the line too.
Yeah, I just think we want to always mention the Transportation Alliance, and most of you know Margaret through MPTA. Some of you might also know her from the Alliance. But Margaret's been a key over the years in terms of leading a coalition effort and bringing together all of us under one tent or one umbrella, if you will. And that, as I mentioned earlier, is key. Working together, we are a lot more powerful. And so it's been helpful to have highway advocates and transit advocates and others, unions and businesses, actually sit at the same table and hear each other out, because even advocates have different priorities and they may not necessarily care about somebody else's priority. But at the end of the day, by talking to each other, we're able to come to some kind of an agreement on a parameter for a legislative package that people can stand up and agree with. And one of the things that both the Transportation Alliance and Move Minnesota do is hold some press events. And so the Transportation Alliance has had numerous press events at the Capitol involving all of the different parties promoting our transportation needs across the state. So I want to thank you, Margaret, for that. That's been helpful. Business groups and local governments groups are also of value. And another example of how a coalition can make a difference, in 2017, MPTA started as a lonely voice of transit systems who were urging legislators to care about volunteer drivers. And there were a few people who were hearing us out, and the voices of our transit systems were getting stronger, and people at the Capitol and also at the county level were starting to hear that this was a concern. The Minnesota Association of Counties took a look at this for their legislative platform. The Association of Townships took a look at it for their legislative platform. We're now a part of a coalition for volunteer, for volunteer driver legislation changes. That includes 90 organizations. So there's local government and human service and transit organizations all working together. And recently we were successful working with the Minnesota Council on Transportation Access in securing their advocacy to resolve this issue with volunteer drivers, both from a definition standpoint where insurance companies consider them to be paid carriers versus volunteers, and then their insurance rates are increased, and then again on this issue of tax subtraction. And I think that might wrap up our presentation, Sam.
It does. We made it.
If
we have less time than we thought we'd have for Q&A. So, are there questions?
Yes, I think we have some questions. So,
Looks like we have a few.
Yeah.
That was long. All right, so here we go.
okay. Okay, so, my favorite topic. Can you tell me more about the fee on transportation network companies? What specifically is that? And I think, how could we use that in Minnesota?
Well, specifically, the proposal that's on the table right now is a 4% fee surcharge on the fares that are collected by the TNCs.
And maybe you should explain TNCs. Uber, Lyft.
This gets back to our paid for hire carriers, and that's why the recommendation is, since they're paid for hire and they're making a profit, that a very tiny piece of that revenue would go to help our public service.
Okay. So this one is for Sam. Related to trunk highway not including transit, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how MnDOT defines increased mobility, and what's the potential for discussing a more comprehensive definition of mobility?
Yeah, so I think that there's, well, my understanding on this sort of gets into lawyering it up. My understanding is that there is a statutory definition that precludes using highway money for transit. But at the same time, my understanding is that if for a sort of transit-specific project, my understanding also is that at the same time, MnDOT can use kind of as part of a larger road reconstruction project, and I know does to some degree use some of those funds for for transit lane, for example, stop infrastructure, biking and walking investments. I mean, I think there is going to need to be a significant kind of rethinking of how mobility is defined, and also just what MnDOT's broader goals are for its system as a whole, right? So MnDOT put out a couple of years ago its Pathways report, which is a climate analysis, and in that report articulated the need for a vehicle miles traveled goal, reduction goal based on the state's Next Generation Energy Act, and it doesn't have one. So there's a variety of kind of broader inputs, I think, that need to be analyzed by MnDOT to determine where investment needs to go, and then kind of figure out how to get that done. So I don't know. I'm noodling around a little bit on answering this because it's kind of a hard question to answer. There's a lot of moving parts, but I think that MnDOT having a kind of a vision for what it's trying to accomplish from a mobility standpoint is important first, and then figuring out how to make sure that its definitions and its processes support that vision is probably the way to go. Because otherwise it sort of ends up being incrementalism at a time when we need a bit more vision about what the whole point of the whole system is.
So we have another question about, I don't think I saw anything on tax increment financing. So TIF districts, is that something that helps transit in Minnesota?
Off the top of my head, I don't have anything to add on that one. It hasn't been on our recent list, although it is something that has been discussed. So unless Margaret has something she wants to add to that, it's a little bit more in her area. So I'm going to ask her to see if she can give you a solid answer.
Well, I think TIF gets a little tricky, but I know the TOD, the transit-oriented development, is something that I think has gotten more attention, and isn't there like a specific funding program. I think it just gets a little more complicated because you're involving local governments and specific projects and trying to figure out the return on the investment. And so it's not quite as straightforward as an actual revenue source where you're increasing a tax or a fee and then using that revenue. It becomes much more tied into a certain development and what the return is on that investment, which can be a little more tricky to quantify and make sure that the revenue actually gets reinvested in transit in particular.
So I got lucky. I had a friend.
Yeah. You also need, if I'm not mistaken, I think in establishing a TIF district, you have to establish, it really is kind of a tool for development, and you need to establish a level of blight in order to establish the TIF district. So there's kind of a little bit of policy justification, and I serve on the Minneapolis Planning Commission, so we review TIF districts all the time from a real estate development standpoint. But I think it would be complicated to kind of meet that criteria for a TIF district on a corridor. So I think it would be pretty complicated. You could do some sort of one-off, like a transit station, maybe within a TIF district. But I think it would be pretty complicated.
What are the chances of a statewide wheelage tax instead of local only?
I'd say probably 0. Again, it is another option, but we seem to have the most difficult time when we talk about something that's statewide. Legislators have moved a little bit closer to local option, where they don't feel like they're necessarily voting for a tax increase themselves. They're authorizing somebody else to vote for a tax increase. So if they made a no new tax pledge, they don't have to violate the no new tax pledge.
And I would just quickly add, the Constitution has a provision about wheelage taxes. So the Constitution requires that wheelage tax revenue be used for roads. And even if it were statewide, I'm not sure it would get over that constitutional hurdle of the money having to be used for roads. So it doesn't seem like a particularly good option for transit. Let's see. What is the best way we can support the passage of a bonding bill? Now there's a softball.
Well, today's the day, tomorrow's the day, for the next 10 days, but I would start now. Contact your legislators. Contact all of your legislators. Many of you live in one district with your transit system, and or work in one district for your transit system, live in another district, and so you have a state representative and you have a state senator. Everybody has at least 2, and you might be blessed and have 4. So this is the time to write your legislators, tell them that a comprehensive transportation bonding package is necessary this year, and that the money for transit and roads can't wait. I would just pound on that omnibus transportation piece, and if you can take a couple extra minutes and talk about some of the challenges your local system is facing, talk about your passengers, talk about your COVID challenge and your ridership, and that this is the year to pass the bonding bill as we look at the funding issues next year. Legislators,
I think also,
it's an election year right now.
I think also so there's kind of 2 issues that have been at play this last year, which is, what is, Sherry showed some of the different brackets of kind of what was included in various bonding bills. And then there's the question of whether the bonding bill passed at all, right? And so there's what's in it and the bonding bill itself. It sounds like we are getting closer and closer to actually getting a bonding bill passed. And I think articulating that at a time when our economy is facing such challenges having a bonding bill and including transportation because of its intersectional benefits is really important. It sounds like that is finally becoming kind of a bipartisan, acknowledged angle for getting this thing passed.
And the Senate bonding chair, Senator Jen Senjum, said himself that if we don't pass the bonding bill with the highest level of transportation spending in it that we've ever seen in Minnesota before the end of the year, next year's bill won't look anything like this due to the spending concerns legislators will have.
And coincidentally, MPTA is co-hosting some transportation forums that are coming up, and they involve legislators and candidates for the legislature. So it's a really good opportunity to not only push for a bonding bill, but just transit funding in general. There are two coming up next week on the 14th and 15th at noon. They're all through Zoom. So we'll send you out the link. And if you can just join in, that would be great. We're going to focus on the Duluth area, the Mankato area, and then on Monday the 19th, we're going to focus on the Moorhead area. So we'll send out those links. It's super easy to join. It doesn't cost anything. You can do it over your lunch hour, and you can add your voice for why transit funding is so important.
And then I'll offer one last thought, also coming up by the end of next week, if not sooner, on the MPTA webpage will be information on the volunteer driver program. We're putting together some brief little snapshot messages which you can use to put on your Facebook page, to use on Twitter, etc. We'll have a series of 4 of them, so one can go out each week between now and the election. And simultaneously, we're sending out information to legislators and to candidates, a fact sheet, if you will, about volunteer drivers. We know that when the legislature comes back into session in January, they're going to be very busy, very big issues. And so we want to get our message out strongly in the next several weeks.
Okay. So I think that's it for the questions.
Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
To our great panelists, you guys did a great job, and we'll be back again tomorrow morning. So thanks, everybody.
See you all.